Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for hitting 200 subscribers. It's quite humbling to know that 200 plus people have come across my videos and decided that it was worthy of a subscription. So thanks again, and let's get into it. Let me just preface this by saying I've been dancing around the core gameplay for a while and working on important but not exactly critical aspects of the game, like the very cool terrain tools, and today I'm going to show you the texture tools. But none of these make a very compelling game by themselves, so my focus over the next couple of weeks is going to be on game object interaction, being able to differentiate between different objects, friends, enemies, quest givers, and so on. And getting this system in place will really open the door to the world by allowing interaction with objects. So I'm really excited about finally getting that foundation in and to start playing around with different mechanics. I've spent a lot of time trying to get the terrain texture working. I've never had to code my own, essentially, painting tool before, so there was a lot of research involved. I was looking at open source photo applications and other game engines to try and piece together something that would work for my purposes. The biggest help, though, was the texture code from the WoW map editing tool called Nogget. I'll put a link to the description, but even with a solid example like that in hand, it still required a lot of work. The texture flow starts by creating texture resources. To do that, I generate an empty resource object that accepts 3 texture variables. So we have the albedo, the normal map, and the rough map. Once I've created that, it just shows up in the list here and I can select it. Now, when painting on the terrain, there's a few things we need to do. We need to store a reference to the selected texture against the chunk. We need to regenerate the alpha map to determine what texture is shown and where. And finally, we need to update the terrain material. The texture system is actually quite simple and only supports a maximum of 4 textures per chunk. But this means we can just generate an RGB image per chunk, where each of the 3 colors, red, green, and blue, correspond to a texture. So that's 3, plus a base texture that is always drawn across the whole chunk. So if I swap the shader output to show the alpha map, you can get a better idea of what's going on. So you can see each of these ones mapped to a texture. And the black is the base texture. So if I paint on here, you can see that each one I paint gets a different color, up to a maximum of 4. If I try and paint with one of these, it won't work. But you can see now if I put the opacity down and start mixing, you see how the colors are mixing in the alpha map. And if I swap back, then you can see that they've overlapped and mixed in there. Texture painting works similarly to terrain editing, except we also pass through the selected texture resource. When painting, we need to keep track of how many textures we've applied in what order. This is important because each texture at the end needs to correspond to a color on the alpha map. So you want to make sure you get that mapping right. So you can see here we're calling a function that either adds the texture or returns the current texture's index. Once we have the texture layer, we can proceed to update the RGB values for each of the pixel in the alpha map to accommodate the changes made when you're applying the texture. So this is a heavily simplified example, but if say you're painting a texture at 100% opacity over other textures, then each texture underneath needs to have their opacity reduced to 0% to make space for the 100% opacity texture. So say you've got 2 textures already painted, one red, one green, and you're painting a texture that corresponds to the blue value. When you paint that at 100%, the red and the green values need to go to 0 to make space for the 100% blue value. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, once the new values have been calculated, you then need to regenerate the alpha map texture and update the chunk material. So I'll just show you the method now that updates the chunk material. So once we've finished painting, we call this function that takes the textures and the alpha map texture, and it just figures out what parameters to set on the shader in the material. If there's one texture, you read the albedo, normal, and rough, like I showed earlier, and set those as shader params. And then in the shader, these are just read in and then combined based on the alpha map. So we get the red, green, blue channels, and then we just combine the normal map, the roughness, and the albedo, and just return those. And that's how you get it all blended together. That's about it for today. I think I'll leave the editor tooling alone for now and focus on actually making the game. I'll keep you updated as soon as I have something to show with the object interaction, which hopefully should be the next couple of weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can jump in the Discord. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, leave a comment and I'll reply here. Thanks.